The train jolted as it pulled into the dusty little town of Ash Hollow. A gust of wind swept across the platform, carrying with it the scent of dry hay, coal smoke, and far-off pine. From one of the cars stepped a young woman wrapped in a worn, rose-colored cloak, her gloved fingers clutching a small leather suitcase as tightly as her breath. Her name was Evelyn Whitaker, and she had traveled more than 1,000 miles to meet a man she had never seen in person, a man she had agreed to marry by letter. She stepped off the train with practiced grace, elegant despite the stiffness in her legs and the weight in her chest. Her heart pounded beneath the lace of her blouse. She looked around for a sign, a man with a hat, a name on a board, someone calling out Evelyn, but no one did. The platform was nearly empty. A few ranch hands leaned against the freight wall, chatting low about crops and horses. A woman with a squalling toddler rushed past. The station agent gave her a nod but said nothing. She checked the envelope again, just to be sure. The name was there in his careful penmanship. Evelyn Whitaker, arriving 18th March 1889. I will be there. Hey, Thomas R. Henley. Thomas. The man who had sent her gentle words, who had written of a modest home and quiet life and called her Dear Evelyn before they'd even met. The man who had promised her a fresh start, a chance at family. And he wasn't here. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn had made her way to the general store with help from the station agent. She was offered a cup of coffee and a small chair in the corner while a telegram was sent out to a man named Arthur Henley, the brother of Thomas. An hour later, a man walked in, removing his hat slowly as he stepped toward her. He was older than Thomas by maybe a decade, with a beard the color of ash and eyes that carried both sorrow and strength. "You're Miss Whitaker," he said quietly. Evelyn stood. "Yes, and you must be Arthur." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'm real sorry to be the one to tell you this, ma'am. Thomas, he passed near a week ago. Fever hit sudden. We didn't know you were coming so soon." Her breath caught. She lowered her eyes, blinking fast. I don't understand," she whispered. Arthur cleared his throat. "If I'd known, I would have written sooner. He kept talking about you, said you were brave, said you had a good heart." He looked down. He was real proud of that last letter he sent. Evelyn sat down, her suitcase still clutched tightly in her lap. The room fell quiet. No tears came, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. Arthur shifted his weight. "Look, I know this ain't what you came here for, but if you've nowhere to go, I have a cabin out past Mill Creek. You'd be welcome to stay till you decide what's next." She looked up, uncertain. "Why would you do that for me?" Arthur gave a small, tired smile. "Because you came all this way for my brother, and because that kind of faith deserves to land on its feet." Outside, the wind picked up again, and just like that, Evelyn's life in Ash Hollow began. Not as a bride, but as a stranger with a broken plan and a quiet blacksmith offering shelter in the storm. The wagon ride to Mill Creek was long and silent. Evelyn sat beside Arthur, her cloak drawn close and her eyes fixed on the rugged landscape. Rolling hills dusted with dry grass, crooked fences, and the distant silhouettes of cattle. The air smelled of iron and pine. Occasionally Arthur glanced her way but said nothing unless it mattered. "You warm enough?" he asked once, his voice low and unhurried. She nodded. "Thank you for everything." He tipped his hat slightly, but his eyes stayed on the road. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun had begun to set. The sky blushed a deep orange, and the shadows of trees stretched long over the dirt path. The house stood humbly beside the forge, a small square structure of dark timber with a smoking chimney and a porch that creaked in the wind. "I built it after the war," Arthur said, helping her down from the wagon. "It ain't much, but it holds together." Evelyn followed him up the steps, her boots crunching softly. Inside, the space was tidy. Simple furnishings, a small hearth, a worn but clean rug, and books stacked near a lamp. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and iron, but not unpleasantly so. "You can have the room on the right," he said, nodding toward a door. "My wife used to keep it for guests." The word wife caught her breath for a moment, but she didn't ask. She merely nodded and stepped inside. The room was small but welcoming. A clean quilt on the bed, a pitcher of water on the table, a lace curtain fluttering slightly at the window. Evelyn sat down, exhaling slowly for what felt like the first time since the train. She stared at the wall and tried to understand her place in this strange, silent chapter of her life. Over the next few days, Evelyn began to find a rhythm. She rose early, helped prepare meals, and cleaned the porch without being asked. She offered to scrub the forge aprons, stacked kindling by the hearth, and once stitched a tear in Arthur's flannel shirt without a word. Arthur, in turn, kept his distance, but not coldly. He was a man of few sentences, but when he spoke, his words held weight. "I'll be at the forge till dusk," he said each morning. And every evening when he returned, she'd hand him a cup of coffee and ask quietly, "How is the day?" They were not friends. Not yet. But a sort of quiet understanding began to settle between them. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled in without warning. Rain battered the cabin roof like 1,000 galloping hooves, and the wind howled like an open mouth. Evelyn stood by the window, watching the flash of lightning over the trees, her fingers gripping the curtain. Arthur appeared behind her, a lantern in hand. "Storms like this don't last long," he said, his voice calm. "But they always feel bigger in the dark." She turned, meeting his eyes. "I suppose most things do." He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. For the first time, he seemed to study her. Not just politely, but with a gaze that held quiet empathy. Not pity, something steadier. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the rain. "You didn't have to take me in." Arthur shook his head. "No, but sometimes two broken paths cross for a reason." Then he set the lantern down and returned to the forge, leaving her with her thoughts and a tiny ember of warmth she hadn't expected to feel again. The days turned warmer, and the thaw of early spring slowly crept over Ash Hollow. Evelyn began to spend more time outside, hanging laundry on the line, sweeping the porch, even tending to the small patch of soil behind the cabin where some brave green shoots had started to appear. The townsfolk had started to notice her, too. When she walked to the general store, Mrs. Elkins behind the counter greeted her with a curious but warm smile. "So you're the girl who came for Thomas," she said one afternoon, handing over a parcel of flour and tea. Evelyn managed a polite smile. "Yes, I was." Mrs. Elkins nodded, as if sensing the story didn't need to be told. "Well, you landed in good hands. That Arthur Henley's a quiet one, but his word's as solid as his iron." Evelyn found herself smiling more genuinely this time. "Yes, ma'am. I've found that to be true." Back at the forge, Arthur worked long hours, shaping steel with the kind of discipline born of hardship. Evelyn would watch him sometimes through the open doors, fascinated by the rhythm of the hammer, the hiss of steam, the spark of metal meeting fire. He didn't mind her presence. In fact, he began to explain small things to her. What the bellows did, how different metals rang with different notes, why horseshoes had to be shaped just so. "You listen better than most men I've met," he remarked one afternoon, offering her a rare half-smile as he wiped his brow. "I suppose I've had practice," she replied. "Letters teach you to read between the lines." Arthur glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but she noticed he didn't correct her or turn away. That night, he brought her a book from his shelf. "Thought you might like this," he said simply, placing it on the kitchen table. It was an old volume of poetry, worn leather, gold leaf faded but intact. Evelyn's fingers traced the edge. "You read poetry?" "I do," he said, pouring water into the kettle. "Don't tell the horses." She let out a small, honest laugh, the kind that slipped out before sorrow could catch it. And Arthur smiled again. Just barely, but enough. As the days grew longer, Evelyn began to feel something unfamiliar returning, a sense of place. She no longer flinched at the creak of the cabin at night or the distant howl of wolves. She began to hum while she cooked. She fixed the hem of an old curtain and taught herself how to make biscuits over the stove. And once, when Arthur came in late from shoeing a stubborn stallion, she stayed up just to make sure he had something warm to eat. "You didn't have to wait," he murmured, sitting across from her in the candlelight. "I know," she said softly, "but I wanted to." Their eyes met. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was full of things neither dared say yet, and yet somehow understood. That night, as she blew out the lantern and climbed into bed, Evelyn placed the poetry book on her nightstand and whispered into the dark, "Maybe this is how new beginnings feel. Not loud, not sudden, just steady." And just outside, beyond the porch and the glowing forge, the stars watched in quiet agreement. The following week, Arthur received a knock at the forge door just after dawn. Evelyn was still inside the cabin, brewing coffee and preparing cornbread when she saw him through the window, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. The man at the door was dressed in fine riding clothes, a town slicker with a trimmed beard and silver cufflinks. He carried a clipboard, his voice too loud for the hour. Evelyn stepped onto the porch with quiet concern. Arthur met her eyes briefly, then turned back to the man. "As I said, Mr. Henley," the man continued, "the railroad company's made its offer. That land behind your forge is valuable. You'd be doing yourself a favor. Arthur's voice was cool. Not interested. But it's just empty pasture now. You'd be doubling your take in a month, and your father did once. I said no, Arthur interrupted. The man pursed his lips. Very well, but they won't offer twice. He tipped his hat toward Evelyn and left with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Evelyn waited until Arthur returned to the porch. You don't want to sell? She asked gently. He shook his head. My father fought for this land. I won't pave it for a company that doesn't care who's buried under it. She nodded. I understand. And she did. Maybe more than she expected to. She too had known what it was to hold on to something because letting go meant erasing part of who you were. Later that week, Arthur took Evelyn into town for the spring market. It was the first time they'd walked side by side through Ash Hollow in full daylight. People stared, but not with judgment, mostly with curiosity. Morning, Arthur, called a few of the ranchers. Evening, miss, said an older woman with a basket of preserves. Evelyn smiled, offering quiet greetings in return. She didn't cling to Arthur's side, but she didn't drift far either. They bought flour, seeds, and oil. Arthur handed her a wrapped bundle near the end, a spool of ribbon, pale blue. For your hair, he said plainly, and then cleared his throat. Or for anything else. Thought it'd suit spring. Evelyn's hand trembled just slightly as she took it. It's lovely. Thank you. Something had changed. Not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. That night, they sat on the porch beneath a sky salted with stars. Arthur sipped coffee from a tin cup while Evelyn read softly from the poetry book he'd lent her weeks ago. The words hung in the air like gentle music. Though silence walks beside me still, a kindness burns where cold once did dwell. Arthur didn't speak for a long while. Then, he set his cup down and said quietly, I used to think nothing new could grow here, that the forge and the field were all I had left. Evelyn looked over. And now? He met her eyes. Now, I'm not so sure. She folded the book gently and placed it in her lap. The air between them shimmered with unsaid things, soft as smoke, steady as iron. In that moment, beneath the hush of the prairie and the warmth of shared quiet, Evelyn realized something. She had not just found a home. She was becoming part of one. Spring brought both bloom and burden. The creek behind Arthur's land swelled with melting snow, and the fields whispered promises of green. But the weather turned unpredictable. Days of sun followed by sudden rains, and winds that howled through the gaps in the window frames like lost voices. One such evening, Evelyn found Arthur standing by the forge long after the fire had cooled. His shoulders were tense, his eyes lost in the glowing embers like he was reading something only he could see. You didn't come in for supper, she said softly, stepping into the doorway with a shawl around her shoulders. He didn't look up. Didn't feel right eating. She approached slowly. Is something wrong? Arthur let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting years to be exhaled. Today's the day I buried her, my wife. Evelyn froze. I don't talk about her, he added. Not to be cruel. Just some things get locked away so tight you forget where the key even is. Evelyn stood beside him now, her fingers laced in front of her, respectful but close. Her name was Joanna. We were married 5 years before fever took her. Same fever that took Thomas. He shook his head. After that, I stayed with the anvil. Easier to shape steel than sorrow. She didn't speak, just listened. I didn't expect you, he admitted. Didn't ask for you, but the house doesn't feel as hollow when you're here. A silence passed, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his arm. I didn't expect to be here either, but that doesn't mean it's not where I'm meant to be. His eyes met hers for a long, searching moment, and in that space there was no need to fill the quiet with anything more. The next morning brought word from town. A flash flood had torn through the southern edge of Ash Hollow. The Henleys' neighbor, an old widow named Maureen, was stranded on her farm, and the road had collapsed near the ridge. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed rope, a lantern, and his coat. Evelyn, without asking, packed a bundle of blankets and bread and followed him out the door. I'm coming, she said firmly. Arthur paused, then nodded. All right, stay close. The ride was treacherous. Mud sucking at the wagon wheels, the wind lashing like whips. By the time they reached Maureen's farm, the lower floor was underwater, and the elderly woman was calling out from a second-story window. Arthur tied the rope around his waist and plunged into the freezing current, guiding Maureen to safety one careful step at a time. Evelyn held the lantern high, her hands trembling but her grip steady. She kept the fire burning in the cabin while Arthur wrapped Maureen in a blanket and gave her hot tea with shaking hands. They stayed the night in the flooded cabin, the three of them huddled around the stove, the wind still wailing outside. Arthur caught Evelyn's gaze across the flickering firelight. She was soaked to the skin, her hair loose, her expression tired, but calm. "You're braver than most men I've known," he said quietly. She smiled, "Only because I've had to be." That night, they didn't speak of love, but something passed between them stronger than words. A bond born not of lightning, but of weathering the storm together. The floodwaters receded slowly, leaving the land soggy and torn. Roads were rutted, fences sagged, and the town worked together in that quiet way prairie folk always did. No grand speeches, just hands in the dirt and backs bent to the task. Arthur and Evelyn returned to the cabin late the next day. They were both exhausted, wet clothes drying on hooks, boots lined with mud, and eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. Evelyn moved through the kitchen, setting the kettle to boil as she often did. But Arthur watched her this time, not with the polite distance of before, but with something steadier, warmer. "You didn't have to come with me," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She turned, brushing a loose curl from her cheek. "I know. You could have stayed where it was safe, warm." She looked up at him then. "But I wouldn't have been where you were." Arthur swallowed, caught off guard by the simplicity of her words. No pretense, no demands, just truth. And in that truth, something softened. Over the following weeks, the rhythm between them grew less like strangers sharing space and more like something else. Not yet lovers, not yet a promise, but a closeness that no longer needed explanation. Arthur built her a small table beside the window where she liked to sit and read. He didn't say it was for her, but she knew. Evelyn, in return, mended the strap on his tool belt and left a fresh biscuit by the forge every morning, still warm in cloth. They spoke more and laughed sometimes. She told him about Boston, about her father's bookstore, and how the scent of old pages was the one thing she still missed. He told her about the first horse he ever shod, how it kicked so hard it bruised his ribs, and he kept the horseshoe anyway, to remember what I didn't know yet. One evening, after supper, Arthur stepped onto the porch and returned with something wrapped in oilcloth. "I've been working on this," he said, placing it gently on the table. Evelyn unwrapped it to find a small iron sculpture, delicate despite the medium, a curling form of a flower bursting open. Not perfect, not ornate, but made with care. Her fingers trembled as she touched it. "You made this?" "I don't make many things that aren't useful," he said, eyes on the floor. "But I thought maybe you'd like something that was just beautiful." Evelyn blinked back sudden tears. "I do." They stood there in the golden light of dusk, silence stretching between them again. But this time, it was thick with meaning. Arthur cleared his throat. "I know I'm not what you came here for, Evelyn. But if I were to ask, if there's a place for me in whatever future you see now..." She stepped forward, gently placing her hand over his, still rough with forged soot. "You didn't ask, Arthur. But you've already been making room in that future, one piece at a time." And for the first time since they met, she leaned into him. Not rushed, not desperate, but steady. His arm rose to meet her, uncertain at first, and then sure. The quiet blacksmith, and the bride who came for a man already gone, now stood in the forge of something new, not shaped by fire alone, but by tenderness, trust, and the shared silence of two people who had been broken and were learning to heal together. The days lengthened, and the air grew warmer with the promise of summer. Wild flowers sprang up along the creekside, and the hills behind the cabin turned lush with life. Evelyn often found herself pausing mid-task, her hands still in the dishwater or her fingers holding a half-written letter, just to breathe in the feeling that had slowly crept over her. Peace. It wasn't loud or showy. It lived in small things, the creak of the porch swing as Arthur sat with his boots off in the evenings, the sound of the wind dancing through the wheatgrass, or the scent of coffee warming on the stove as the sun peeked over the ridge. And Arthur, he had changed too, not all at once, and not in ways the town might notice. But Evelyn saw it in how he spoke now, in how his eyes softened when they met hers, how he stayed at the table just a little longer after supper, how he paused his work when she read aloud from her favorite book of poems, listening like the words were being written in iron. One quiet morning, Evelyn walked into town alone for the first time. She wore the blue ribbon he had given her, tied simply around her braid. Heads turned, some with curiosity, others with smiles. She stopped by the seamstress, then the baker, then the post office where a letter had arrived from Boston. The clerk handed it to her with raised brows. "Someone from home?" Evelyn looked down at the envelope, recognizing her younger sister's handwriting. Her throat tightened, but she smiled. "Yes, though home feels like a different place now." That night, as twilight painted the horizon in dusty rose, she and Arthur sat on the porch in companionable silence. The letter from Boston remained unopened in her lap. "I saw the town today," she said, eyes still on the distant trees. "It's different when you walk through it alone." Arthur nodded. "Feels smaller, but sometimes it makes you feel bigger." She turned to him. "Do you ever think about what people say? About us, I mean." He met her gaze evenly. "I don't much care what they say. I care what you think." Evelyn smiled, warm and slow. "Then let me be clear. What I think is, I didn't come to Ash Hollow for you, but I stayed for you." Arthur's expression didn't shift immediately, but his hand moved to cover hers on the armrest, strong and steady. "I reckon I've never had much," he said. "But if I could offer you a life, quiet, honest, maybe not grand but real, would that be enough?" She looked down at their hands, then back at him. "It would be everything." Later that evening, as Evelyn lit the lamp inside, she finally opened the letter from her sister. It was filled with well-meaning questions, polite concern, and subtle hints for her to come home, to find someone else, to start over properly. Evelyn read it once. Then she folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer next to the ribbon Arthur had wrapped for her weeks ago, because she had started over. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something better to begin. She was already living it. Summer settled fully over Ash Hollow, bringing long golden afternoons and nights thick with the scent of lilac and fresh earth. The forge rang early and late as Arthur's work picked up with the season. Horses to shoe, tools to mend, wagon wheels to fix. But even with long hours, his steps grew lighter. Not rushed, just rooted. Evelyn began to tend a garden beside the cabin. Nothing large, just rows of beans, herbs, and a few hopeful tomato plants. She wore a straw hat and kept a journal tucked beneath the porch rail, where she scribbled thoughts when the soil clung to her gloves and the sun warmed her back. The townspeople had grown used to her now. They no longer called her the girl who came for the dead man. They called her Miss Whitaker, or sometimes just Evelyn. And when they saw her at the market or passing the chapel, they nodded like she belonged, because she did. One evening, Arthur came home later than usual. The sky had turned to ember, and Evelyn was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a quiet smile. "Long day?" she asked as he sat beside her. "Mr. Kellerman's wagon lost a wheel halfway to the canyon. Took hours to get it fixed. I reckon the wheel was older than I am." Evelyn laughed softly. "Sounds like he needs a new one." Arthur took a sip, watching the horizon. "I've been thinking." She looked over, waiting. "You've built something here," he said. "Something of your own. I see it in the way you talk to the soil, the way the cabin's warmer since you came. And I guess I just—" He paused, then cleared his throat. "I don't want to just be part of your start. I want to keep building with you." Evelyn's heart skipped. "I don't have a ring," Arthur added, fumbling slightly. "And I know I'm no poet. But if there's a corner of that future you carry around, I'd be grateful to stand in it." She set her cup down gently. "You've already stood in it, Arthur. Every day you showed up with patience and truth, every quiet kindness, every time you let me just be." He looked at her, eyes wide but steady. Evelyn smiled. "So yes, I'll keep building too." And then, without pretense or fanfare, he leaned forward and kissed her, softly, reverently. Not like claiming something, like recognizing something already there. The porch creaked. The wind rustled the garden leaves. The stars blinked quietly awake. And between them, a life began to forge itself, not in sudden bursts, but in the steady heat of a fire that didn't burn out. The days after their promise passed with a kind of golden stillness. Nothing extravagant changed. No grand announcements, no rush into town. But in every quiet moment, something deepened. Arthur started leaving small sketches near the hearth, designs for a larger porch, a barn addition, even a small shed Evelyn could turn into a reading room. He didn't mention them aloud, but the pages appeared like whispers of intention, like a man who didn't just want to share space, but future. Evelyn noticed, and in return, she began stitching new curtains for the bedroom. She scrubbed the old cedar chest until it shone and lined it with fresh linens. When she found an old piece of oak behind the shed, she painted their initials on it, A and E, and hung it beside the door with a nail and a smile. It was never spoken as a wedding date. There was no chapel, no music. Just one afternoon, Arthur stood beside her as she watered the garden and said, "You're already my wife in every way that matters." And she replied, "Then that's enough for me." The town came to accept it quickly. Mrs. Elkins sent over a pie with a note that simply read, "I knew he had it in him." The preacher tipped his hat and didn't press. And the neighbor boys who once joked about the blacksmith's ghost bride now stopped by to help chop firewood, trading work for Evelyn's warm cornbread. But not everyone welcomed change with such grace. One hot July morning, a carriage pulled up outside the cabin, its wheels fine and lacquered, its windows clean. A man stepped down wearing a gray suit, Boston style. Evelyn froze as he approached the porch. She knew that chin, that watch chain, that polite, narrow gaze. "Francis," she breathed. Her cousin. He removed his hat. "Evelyn, I've come to bring you home." Arthur stepped onto the porch just behind her, quiet but solid. Francis barely looked at him. "You can't stay here. Living unmarried with a tradesman in the wilderness. What do you think people will say back home?" Evelyn straightened. "I don't think of Boston as home anymore." Francis frowned. "Your father's bookstore was sold. Your sister's in Providence now. There's nothing left for you here." She took a deep breath. "Then it's a good thing I'm not here for what was left. I'm here for what I've made." Arthur hadn't moved, but his hand found hers behind her back. Francis stared. "You were supposed to marry a Henley, and now look at you." She smiled, small, certain. "I did marry a Henley, just not the one I expected, and he's everything I didn't know I needed." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind across the porch and the soft creak of wood beneath their feet. Then Francis replaced his hat. "Suit yourself." He left without another word. That night, Arthur found Evelyn sitting alone in the garden, fingers trailing over the shoots of basil. He sat beside her in the dirt, not caring about the soil on his trousers. "Everything all right?" She nodded slowly. "I think I finally let go of the life I thought I was supposed to live. And now I can finally live the one I chose." Arthur looked up at the stars. "You gave me back more than I ever thought I'd hold again." She smiled. "And you gave me a name I didn't expect to love so much." He looked at her. "Henley?" She nodded. "Henley." And in that moment, under the moonlight, and between the scent of earth and iron, they weren't just a story of loss and recovery. They were a story still unfolding. Together. The wind shifted near the end of summer, as it always did in Ash Hollow, cooler in the mornings, sharper in the evenings. The fields turned golden, and Evelyn began pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders at night. Crickets sang louder. The forge glowed longer. But this year it felt different. It felt like something new was waiting to begin. Arthur had cleared a small plot of land near the creek and built a simple wooden bench beneath the cottonwoods. One morning, Evelyn found a path of flat stones leading from the cabin to the bench, laid by hand, imperfect and beautiful. She followed it with bare feet and tears in her eyes. "You made this for me," she said, when Arthur came walking from the forge, a smear of soot on his cheek. He nodded. "Figured you'd want a place to think, or write, or just rest." Evelyn reached for his hand and squeezed it. "You know me better than most who've known me a lifetime." He met her eyes. "That's because I see you as you are, not as anyone expects you to be." In town, the autumn harvest festival approached. A time of music, pie contests, and dancing under lanterns strung between the oaks. Evelyn had never attended. Back east, such gatherings were rare and always restrained, formal, cold. But here it was different. Here, the town square came alive with color and voices. Even the blacksmith got invited, though he rarely went. "This year," Evelyn insisted. "You promised me a proper dance," she teased as she hemmed her skirt. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "I did no such thing." "You're a Henley now," she said with a smirk. "You're bound to me by honor and biscuit." He laughed and gave in. That night, Evelyn wore her blue ribbon in her hair and a dress the color of cream. Arthur combed his hair and wore the good shirt she'd mended months ago. They arrived at dusk, lanterns already glowing in the trees, children laughing through hay bales, and the air sweet with cinnamon and cider. They danced. At first, awkwardly. Arthur was stiff, and Evelyn tried not to step on his boots, but soon they found a rhythm, like everything else they had built together. Quiet, steady, true. After the second song, Evelyn noticed something. A small group of townspeople watching them. Not gossiping, just smiling. It was Mrs. Elkins who said it out loud. "You look like you've always belonged to each other." Arthur glanced at Evelyn. "Feels that way." And Evelyn, with tears prickling behind her smile, whispered, I think I finally believe in meant to be. Later, as they returned home beneath the stars, Arthur paused by the porch, looking up at the cabin that now bore her touch in every corner. I've been thinking, he said, his voice rough with nerves. We didn't do things the usual way, but I'd still like to stand beside you in front of a preacher one day. Not because we have to, but because I want the world to know I'm yours. Evelyn touched his face gently. You've been mine since the moment you made space for me in your quiet life. He leaned down then and kissed her forehead, slow and full of promise. That night, she wrote in her journal, some stories don't begin with love. They begin with loss. But the best ones are forged in fire and shaped by kindness. And the man I was never meant to meet became the one I was always meant to find. Fall deepened, casting golden hues across the hills and turning the air crisp with every sunrise. The forge burned brighter as Arthur took on more work before winter set in, and Evelyn found herself preserving fruit, stitching new quilts, and preparing the cabin like it was a place they'd be in for decades, because she hoped it would be. One morning, she stood by the creek, watching as leaves floated across the surface like tiny boats on a slow river. Her hands rested on her middle where a quiet suspicion had begun to grow, a suspicion she hadn't spoken aloud just yet. Back in the cabin, she read and reread her sister's old letters, noticing how they spoke of babies and changing seasons like they were tied together. She placed one hand gently on her stomach and smiled, not with certainty, but with the soft bloom of maybe. She'd wait, let it settle in her bones first, because life had taught her that joy, when held gently, could become something lasting. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Arthur sat beside her on the floor, his back against the chair, eyes closed as she read from a worn book of stories he'd forgotten he owned. When she finished the final line, he opened one eye and said, You know what I realized? Evelyn closed the book. What's that? That I don't remember what silence sounded like before you filled it with meaning. She leaned her head against his shoulder. And I don't remember what waiting felt like before you made staying still feel like home. He reached for her hand. Are you happy, Evelyn? She turned her palm to his and held it tightly. I'm more than happy. I'm growing. His brow furrowed. Growing? Evelyn hesitated. Then she smiled. There might be more than just us soon. Arthur stilled, his thumb still resting against hers. You mean? She nodded slowly. I think we're going to be parents. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was sacred. Arthur exhaled, eyes closing for a long, trembling breath. Then he turned and pulled her close, not with desperation, but with awe. You've given me more life than I ever thought I'd deserve, Evelyn, more than I even asked for. She kissed the corner of his mouth and whispered, And you gave me a place to plant every dream I was afraid to believe in. They sat like that for a long time, two people shaped by loss and healing, now forming something entirely new. Not just a marriage, not just a home, a future. Together they weren't rebuilding anymore. They were growing roots. Snow arrived early that year, soft and heavy, blanketing Ash Hollow in silence. It muffled the sounds of wagons, quieted the creek, and turned the forge's smoke into thin ribbons against a pale sky. Arthur adjusted his hours, choosing to work mornings while the light lasted, and returned to the cabin before dusk. Evelyn didn't ask him to, but he did it anyway, always one step ahead of her needs, always near enough to catch her when she grew tired and wouldn't admit it. She was now visibly showing, her figure gently rounded beneath her wool coat, and the townsfolk had begun offering warm smiles and congratulations when they saw her in town. She looks brighter every time I see her, Mrs. Elkins said one day. She is the fire in that man's forge now, someone replied, and Evelyn heard it, and tucked the words away like a treasure. Inside the cabin, things shifted subtly. Arthur built a cradle with his own hands, simple, strong, sanded smooth until it shone like honey. He didn't say much while he worked on it, but Evelyn caught him more than once sitting beside it afterward, silent and thoughtful, palm resting on the edge like he could already feel the baby's weight inside. One afternoon, as Evelyn sorted baby clothes gifted by the town, Arthur set a tin box on the table beside her. What's this? She asked, lifting the lid. Inside were dozens of letters, some creased and yellowed, some never opened. Thomas's, Arthur said. Letters he wrote to you. He kept copies. Said he liked how the words looked on the page. I found them again when I was cleaning out the back room. Evelyn stared down at the bundle, a hush falling between them. I thought you might want to read them. Or not, Arthur added softly. Either way, I wanted you to decide. She picked one up and turned it gently in her hands. Maybe, she said, when the baby's born, so I can tell them who Thomas was, and how, because of him, I found you. Arthur didn't speak. He simply leaned in and pressed a kiss to her forehead, long and reverent. The first snowstorm came in early December. Wind howled across the hills and rattled the cabin's shutters, but the fire inside never faltered. Evelyn sat wrapped in quilts, knitting a tiny cap. Arthur sat on the floor, repairing a saddle strap by lantern light. "Do you think it'll be a boy or a girl?" she asked, glancing up. Arthur thought for a moment. "I don't know, but I think either way they'll be brave." "Because of you?" He smiled. "Because of us." Evelyn placed the half-finished cap in her lap and reached for his hand. "You've given me more than I ever asked for, Arthur. A home, a family, a love I never thought I'd get to feel." He looked at her with that slow, quiet warmth he always had, like everything in the world could fall away, and he'd still be standing steady with her. "You brought that love with you when you stepped off that train, Evelyn. I just happened to be the one who opened the door." And outside, as snow danced past the windows and the world turned still, the cabin glowed like a lantern on a cold hill, two hearts waiting to become three, wrapped in the softest kind of hope, the kind that never needed to be loud, to last forever. January came with sharp winds and skies the color of steel. The snow lay thick and undisturbed around the cabin, and smoke from the forge curled upward like a steady breath. Inside, the air was warm, the fire constant, and Evelyn's belly full with life, nearly ready to meet the world. Arthur built a cradle beside their bed, but lately he had taken to running his hand across the wooden frame in the evenings, as if already soothing a baby's cry that hadn't come yet. Evelyn noticed. She didn't say anything, but she saw, and she felt it too, the nearness of something enormous, something that would remake them both. One night, while a storm raged quietly outside, Evelyn woke to find Arthur sitting by the fire, turning a small piece of iron in his hand. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him. "What are you doing up?" she asked. He glanced at her, offering a sheepish smile. "Thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, then held up the piece of iron. It was shaped into letters, rough, unfinished, but clear. "A name." "Clara." Evelyn blinked. "I've been thinking," he said softly. "If it's a girl, maybe we name her Clara, after my mother." Evelyn traced the name with her fingertips. "It's beautiful." Arthur studied her face. "You don't have to agree, I just thought—" "I do agree," she interrupted gently. "It's a good name, strong, soft, like her father." His breath caught, and he set the iron piece down slowly. "And if it's a boy?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then maybe Thomas." Arthur looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'd like to think your brother's still part of this family," she said. "He brought me here, even if it wasn't the way he planned. He was the beginning, and this child, they're the future." Arthur wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "You make the past feel like something I can carry," he whispered. She smiled into his chest. "Because you don't carry it alone anymore." The next morning, they hung the name plaque on the wall above the cradle. Clara or Thomas, depending on who arrived first. Neighbors came to check on them now and then, bringing firewood, dried herbs, even a quilt stitched by the women at the church, though Evelyn had never asked for any of it. "You've made this place feel lived in," said Mrs. Elkins as she handed her the quilt. "Arthur Henley used to go whole winters without saying 10 words. Now he talks about seeds and paint colors and what size boots a little one might need." Evelyn laughed softly, her hand resting on her belly. "I suppose we've both been reshaped." Mrs. Elkins tilted her head. "No, honey, you weren't reshaped. You were revealed." That night Arthur lit the forge long after the cabin had gone quiet. Not to work, but to think. He stared into the coals as if they held answers. He'd never imagined this life. Not after war. Not after burying his wife. Not after losing Thomas. But now, with Evelyn's hand in his and a child on the way, he finally understood something he'd never dared believe before. Some things don't have to be forged by fire. Some things grow in the stillness after. It began on a night so still, even the wind seemed to hush in reverence. The moon hung high over Ash Hollow, pale and full, casting silver light across the snow-covered fields. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled gently, the kettle steamed quietly, and Evelyn gripped the edge of the table with both hands as a sharp, undeniable pain bloomed through her body. Arthur was at her side in an instant. "Is it?" She nodded, jaw clenched. "It's time." He helped her to the bed, his hands steady even though his heart raced beneath his flannel shirt. "I'll ride for Mrs. Rudd," he said. "She's helped with half the births in this valley." Evelyn caught his sleeve. "Don't take too long." He kissed her forehead. "I won't." And then he was gone. Into the moonlight, into the cold, his horse galloping down the trail as if it understood the urgency too. Inside the cabin, Evelyn breathed through the waves of pain, her fingers twisting the edge of the quilt she had stitched herself months earlier. She whispered to the baby, to herself, to God, "Come when you're ready." "I'm ready." Time became a blur. The flicker of the lantern, the sound of snow melting on the roof, the memory of Arthur's voice saying her name like it was something sacred. Then the door burst open. Arthur returned with Mrs. Rudd and her daughter in tow. They carried blankets, boiled water, quiet confidence, and for the next few hours the cabin became a place suspended outside of time, just breath and sweat, and the aching crescendo of life making its way into the world. Arthur waited outside the room, pacing, fists clenched at his sides, ears tuned to every sound. And then a cry, high, clear, fierce. He froze. The door opened slowly, and Mrs. Rudd stepped out, smiling, her apron stained, her hands trembling just a little from the miracle she'd helped deliver. "It's a girl," she said. Arthur's breath left him like a released prayer. "She's strong," the woman added, "like her mother." He stepped inside the room like it was holy ground. Evelyn lay back against the pillows, her hair damp, her face tired and glowing with something deeper than light. In her arms, wrapped in the quilt from the cradle, was the smallest person Arthur had ever seen. Their daughter. Evelyn looked up at him with tear-glossed eyes. "Clara," she whispered. Arthur knelt beside the bed and reached out one shaking finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. It closed around him with surprising strength. "I'll make this world good for you," he murmured. "I swear it." Evelyn smiled. "You already have." That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He sat beside the cradle and watched the rise and fall of their daughter's breath. He held Evelyn's hand as she rested, and as dawn began to creep over the hills, casting light on the snow and the forge and the old oak trees, he knew. This wasn't just a chapter. It was a legacy. A quiet blacksmith, a mail-order bride who became everything, and now a family. The weeks that followed Clara's birth passed in a haze of wonder and warmth. Outside, snow still covered the hills in hushed white silence, but inside the cabin, life pulsed in full color. Evelyn moved slowly but gracefully, her arms cradling the tiny bundle of new breath and heartbeat. Clara's eyes were bright from the start, gray like a storm that had never learned to be afraid. She had Arthur's stillness and Evelyn's fire, wrapped in a body no longer than the span of her father's forearm. Neighbors came bearing gifts, knitted socks, bundles of dried lavender, jars of peach preserves, and they came with wide grins and gentle hands, everyone eager for a glimpse of the child born in a winter storm. Arthur, the man once known for his silence, now spoke softly to the baby every morning. "You've got your mother's eyes, little one. That means you'll see more than most." And at night, after the fire was low, and Evelyn rested with Clara curled against her chest, he would stand beside the cradle, polishing tools or gently rocking the wood with his hand, whispering promises into the hush. One afternoon, Clara let out her first laugh, sharp and sudden and pure. Evelyn had been singing softly, humming a melody her mother once sang to her, when the sound escaped from the tiny lungs beside her heart. She froze in place, eyes wide, then laughed herself, bright and tearful. Arthur rushed in from the porch, breath caught. "What happened?" Evelyn turned to him, beaming. She laughed. He stared at them, then knelt beside the chair, brushing his calloused fingers along Clara's cheek. "Did you?" he whispered, and she laughed again, shorter this time, like a secret only they could hear. Arthur blinked hard and sat back on his heels. "That," he said with reverence, "was the finest sound this forge has ever known." Evelyn began to write again. In the quiet of early mornings, before the forge clanged and the baby stirred, she'd sit at the table with pen in hand and a steaming cup of coffee, pouring memories into pages. She wrote about the letter that brought her here, the man she didn't expect to love, and the child who made her body a cathedral. She titled the collection simply, Ash Hollow, A Beginning. Arthur teased her when he found the notebook. "You're going to write us into legend," she smiled. "We already are, you just don't know it yet." Spring waited just beyond the hills now. Buds trembled on bare branches. The creek gurgled again, freshly thawed. Birds returned to the trees. One evening, Arthur walked out to the bench beneath the cottonwoods, Evelyn's bench, and found her there with Clara in her arms, wrapped in a quilt, singing softly to the wind. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her and took her free hand. They stayed like that until the sun dipped low and the stars began to gather. And in that quiet, they understood what they had built wasn't just a life together. It was a place, a home where love was shaped day by day, in fire, in stillness, in laughter. Spring unfolded over Ash Hollow like a slow, sure promise. The snow melted into thirsty soil, and green returned to the hills. Arthur turned the earth behind the cabin, expanding the garden Evelyn had begun the year before. Clara, now old enough to sit upright with help, watched from a quilt laid out beneath the budding cottonwoods, her tiny fingers reaching for petals and sunlight. Evelyn often joined her there, writing in her notebook or humming lullabies that drifted across the wind like something holy. Her hair was longer now, wavy from the dry air, and her skin had taken on the soft glow of a woman who belonged fully to the life she had chosen. Arthur would glance over from the field, hammer in hand, and feel something in his chest that was both grounding and unfamiliar. Joy, not the kind that comes in bursts and fades, but the kind that stays. The kind that roots itself in the bones and changes the way a man walks through the world. One afternoon, Arthur returned from town with something tucked under his arm, wrapped in canvas, tied with a simple leather cord. He handed it to Evelyn without a word. She opened it slowly, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a beautifully framed document. Handwritten, formal, and lined with elegant ink strokes. Marriage license, Arthur Henley and Evelyn Whitaker. Witnessed by Maureen Elkins and Isaac Rudd, 23rd of April. Evelyn looked up, stunned. When? Arthur rubbed the back of his neck. You once said the world didn't need to know to make it real. But I thought maybe we could let it know anyway. Tears welled in her eyes. You remembered the day we met? He smiled gently. I remember every day since. She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and sure. And when she pulled back, she whispered, Then let's hang it above the hearth so Clara grows up knowing where she came from. That night, after Clara had drifted to sleep and the fire had burned low, Evelyn wrote a final line in her notebook before closing it. A woman stepped off the train expecting to find a husband. Instead, she found the rest of her life, quiet, imperfect, full of iron and tenderness. And somehow that was more than enough. She tucked the book away and joined Arthur by the window, where the stars looked close enough to touch. His arm wrapped around her waist, warm and familiar, and the silence between them felt like a language they had written together. Outside, the forge cooled for the night. Inside, the fire in their home and in their hearts burned on. Not in bursts, not in flames, but in the shape of forever.